No blaring alarm clocks jolting them from sleep. No neatly scheduled leisure days marked on a calendar. No financial safety net or government program serving as a fallback plan if things went wrong. For a medieval peasant, each dawn presented not a new objective to pursue or a choice to make, but a stark, unyielding command whispered by necessity: survive. Long before the first tentative rays of the sun appeared on the horizon, before the sky began to lighten from velvet black to a bruised purple, they would stir into the brutal, chilly air of their dwelling. Their bodies, perpetually aching from yesterday's relentless labor, would already feel burdened by the weight of the day's inescapable obligations. There was no cushion of opulence, no robust safety net built to catch them against the inevitable failures of crops, health, or fortune. From the rain-swept lands of feudal Europe to the sun-baked continents of Asia, the vast plains of Africa, and the complex societies of the pre-Columbian Americas, peasants existed not primarily as abstract figures in distant historical accounts or economic data points, but as individuals locked in a constant, quiet, daily, and unyielding struggle for simple existence. Yet endure they did. They persisted not armed with inherited wealth, political power, or advanced technology, but with something more fundamental: practical knowledge honed over generations, skilled hands accustomed to shaping stubborn materials, and systems of survival constructed ingeniously from whatever basic materials the earth provided. Mud dug from the soil, bones salvaged from carcasses, and the invaluable, intricate tapestry of inherited memory and tradition passed down through whispered words and observed actions. This marks the beginning of their day, an awakening that commenced not with a gentle transition, but in profound darkness, a kind that didn't just obscure the physical surroundings, but seemed to permeate one's very being, a dense, palpable absence of light. Coldness, a constant companion from autumn through spring, hung in the air like frozen breath made visible. No roaring fire provided immediate warmth. The hearth might hold only banked embers or cold ashes. No voice from outside called out a summons or announced the time. Still, the peasant awakened. Time was not tracked by intricate mechanical devices or segmented by artificial alarms. Instead, the body itself served as the timepiece. It had learned through generations of hardship to listen to the subtle cues of the environment and its own internal rhythms. The faint, familiar sound of damp wood creaking as the structure settled in the cold. The almost imperceptible shift in weight as someone else in the communal sleeping area stirred and began to rise nearby. The distant muffled sound of livestock, a cow lowing softly, a sheep coughing, chickens restive in their enclosure just outside or even inside the dwelling, provided natural markers of the approaching dawn or the need for attention. Across much of the medieval world, sleep was not a continuous, unbroken period as we largely experience it today. It was commonly divided into two segments: a first sleep, lasting a few hours after dusk, followed by a period of wakefulness in the deep of the night, and then a second sleep that lasted until true dawn. In that intervening hour or two, the world of the peasant quietly continued, a nocturnal microlife. This was the designated hour for attending to things that could not, must not be postponed until full light. In some regions, individuals rose silently in the darkness to rekindle embers carefully hidden beneath layers of ash the previous night, coaxing just enough heat from the dying fire to ward off the biting cold and prevent illness from settling into chilled bones. Others used this time to provide a small measure of feed for essential chickens or livestock, or to stir fermenting jars of weak beer, grain mash, or preserved foods stored in the coolest, most shadowed corners of the hut. In parts of feudal Japan, farmers used this brief hour of wakefulness to venture quietly outside into the crisp night air and assess the sky, not for its aesthetic beauty or the pattern of the stars, but for the most subtle indications of impending weather. A particular density in the wind, a shift in its direction, or a specific feel to the moisture in the air might portend an early crop-damaging frost or the arrival of a needed rain. In the villages nestled in the valleys of the Balkans, the absence of a familiar sound, the bark of a specific dog that should be on watch, the call of a night bird, might signal a potential threat moving silently through the surrounding, often dangerous woods. It was also a time dedicated in its own way to reflection. Not contemplation or abstract thought in the contemporary sense, but something more measured, more practical, and more profound. Prayers softly uttered before small, simple icons or carved wooden figures in the dim light, a quiet seeking of blessing or protection. Conversations spoken so quietly, so intimately, that they were barely discernible whispers, sharing worries or plans for the coming day. With no expensive candles or oil lamps to spare for extended light, and no demanding physical labor yet required, the mind navigated these hours differently, often turning inward or focusing on immediate, tangible concerns. Children stirred restlessly in their communal straw beds, their small limbs intertwined beneath rough wool coverings for shared warmth. Elderly individuals, their bodies frail and sleep less deep, might sit silently by the wall near the cold hearth, listening not necessarily to anything specific, but to the quality of the night itself, the sounds of the dwelling, the wind outside, the distant rustling that might signal an animal or something else. This space in the deep night was not necessarily filled with overwhelming fear, though threats were real but with a heightened state of awareness, a quiet vigilance born of vulnerability. This world lacked electric switches to flip on light or digital screens to scroll through distractions. Time progressed because the body's internal rhythm, honed by generations of this nocturnal pattern, dictated that it should. The initial sleep concluded because the dwelling required attention, because the few precious cattle or sheep were restless, because instinct whispered that it was time to check the crucial, dying embers of the fire. And when the hour or two had passed and the cold of the night deepened slightly before the approach of dawn, they returned to slumber. Not because the day had arrived, but because there was still necessary, back-breaking work awaiting them when it finally did. Clothing wasn't chosen for appearance, personal expression, or fashion trends that didn't exist for their class. Its sole fundamental purpose was protection, a barrier, however thin, against the relentless cold, wind, rain, sun, and the physical abrasion of labor. And for the medieval peasant, the act of dressing each morning wasn't a moment of comfort or ease. It was, from the very first layer, the initial stark, physical reminder that survival came at a price measured in discomfort and resilience. The initial layer was often a simple tunic or chemise, made of linen if one was fortunate enough to possess it. Thin, worn smooth with age and washing, seldom truly clean, and offering little warmth on its own. Above this came the essential layer of wool, the ubiquitous fabric of medieval Europe. It was coarse, stiff with natural lanolin and residual dirt, and perpetually irritating to the skin, causing a constant, low-level itch. It was consistently rough to the touch, retaining the pungent scent of sheep, wood smoke from the hearth, and the sweat of labor. When not properly cleaned, a laborious process involving ash lye and hard scrubbing, often infrequent, it harbored lice, fleas, and other parasites that were too time-consuming, if not impossible, to fully eliminate. In Northern and Western Europe, wool was paramount. Its dense weave offered decent defense against wind and dampness, yet its inherent roughness in the parasites it harbored caused persistent itching and discomfort that was simply accepted as part of life. For the vast majority, soft cotton from distant lands was unavailable, a rare and expensive import, and silk was an unimaginable luxury, acquired only through illicit means or glimpsed on the bodies of the elite. Peasants lived their lives enveloped in fabrics that caused discomfort, but were absolutely essential for staying warm enough to survive the cold seasons. Far from the wool-dependent lands of Europe, the specific materials and textures of hardship varied, but the underlying principle remained brutally constant. Clothing was a necessity born of labor and discomfort. In Japan, many peasants wore clothing made from plant fibers, particularly the inner bark of trees like the paper mulberry. This bark was steeped in water, boiled for hours, laboriously pounded into threads, and then tightly woven into garments called kaji or bashofu, if made from banana fiber. These clothes were rigid, unyielding, sometimes treated with wax or ashes to enhance their resistance to weather, but they stiffened uncomfortably in winter's cold and were hot and uncomfortable in summer's humidity. Yet they were remarkably durable, able to withstand the rigors of fieldwork. In parts of Africa, particularly where cotton was not widely cultivated or processed by peasants, clothing was fashioned from raffia palm fibers or beaten tree bark, kapa or tapa cloth, occasionally softened with plant oils, but still stiff, prone to tearing, and difficult to sew or repair. In colder regions across continents, animal hides were added, crudely stitched together with sinew, with the rough, less processed side often turned inward to trap body heat, resulting in a rough, unyielding inner surface. In the high-altitude Andes, alpaca or llama wool was highly valued for warmth, but even in its unrefined, homespun state, it was significantly coarser than modern processed wool. People typically slept in the same basic garments they wore for work. There was no concept of changing clothes for different activities or for sleep, only adding or removing outer layers, depending on the temperature. Underwear was often minimal or non-existent. Color was a rarity, a luxury. Vibrant dyes were expensive. The processes labor-intensive, and often reserved for ceremonial attire, the clothes of the ruling class, or religious vestments. When color was attempted by peasants, it was derived from readily available but muted sources, roots, certain insects, like cochineal, but often not available to the poorest, crushed plant matter, or even rusted iron boiled for hours over a smoky fire, yielding dull browns, grays, and faded yellows. A faint reddish shade in your tunic might have originated from crushed madder root boiled laboriously for hours. A dull brownish yellow could signify weeks of soaking plant fibers in fermented urine and bark tannins to set the color. Nothing came easily, not even the simplest aesthetic addition of color. Seams were hand-reinforced with thick thread or sinew, and tiers were patched repeatedly with whatever material was available, sometimes a scrap of leather, sometimes a piece of woven plant fiber, sometimes even rope unraveled. In some areas, woven fabrics were waxed or treated with animal fat to repel water. In others, it was simply accepted that rain would penetrate, leaving them perpetually damp during wet seasons. When a peasant dressed in the morning, pulling on those stiff, itchy layers, it was never about how they looked or felt comfortable. Every thread represented labor, cultivating the fiber, processing it, spinning the thread, weaving the cloth, and every rough, uncomfortable layer served as a constant physical reminder that warmth and protection from the elements incurred a significant, tangible cost. Comfort was not the objective of medieval peasant clothing. Sheer, unyielding resilience was. A home for a medieval peasant was not a dwelling purchased with accumulated wealth or built from standardized, commercially produced materials according to architects' plans. It was a structure erected by hand, often with the help of neighbors through communal labor, using whatever the local earth and environment provided. It was always constructed with the implicit, wary understanding that it would necessitate continuous maintenance and repair against the elements and the passage of time. For the medieval peasant, shelter was not a sealed barrier against nature. It was an intrinsic, porous part of it, existing in a constant dialogue with the external world. In the high-altitude Andes, houses were traditionally constructed from adobe, sun-dried bricks meticulously composed of a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung, pounded and shaped by hand. These thick-walled homes retained warmth during the biting cold mountain nights and remained relatively cool under the intense, high-altitude sun during the day. The materials were universally locally sourced, the labor was collaborative and community-based, and the results were modest, often one- or two-room structures, yet effective shelters against the harsh mountain climate. Similar, though structurally different, earth-based structures rose in many parts of West Africa, where millet stalks, woven branches, and mud were expertly combined to create durable walls and sometimes impressive dome-shaped roofs that offered surprising resistance to both wind and intense heat. In Eastern Europe and parts of Northern Europe, dwellings were commonly built using the wattle and daub technique, a framework of woven wooden branches, wattle, coated thickly with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal manure, daub. It had a distinctive pungent odor when first applied, yes, but it dried into a hard, reasonably insulating wall material that functioned adequately for its purpose. Floors were quite literally dirt, not a figurative description. Packed earth, sometimes smoothed and hardened by years of use and layers of grime, sometimes layered with fresh straw or rushes to cushion steps and absorb moisture. Over time, spilled cooking oils, accumulated dust, and the natural oils from feet and skin would darken and smooth these earth floors, occasionally giving them an almost polished appearance in well-used areas. Wooden floorboards or tiles were non-existent luxuries. Insulation was limited to the natural properties of the building materials and whatever was stuffed into cracks. Roofs were low-slung, with sharp angles designed to shed heavy snow or rain quickly. Typically thatched with readily available materials like reed, palm fronds, straw, or rushes, they required annual upkeep and repair. Leaks were not an unexpected disaster, but an anticipated nuisance, patched routinely with fresh mud or bundles of thatch. In certain parts of the Ottoman Empire and Eastern Europe, peasants added animal hides or layers of heavy felt to reinforce thatch during particularly heavy winters, securing them with vines or animal gut bindings. Windows were scarce and small. Any opening meant cold air intrusion and a loss of precious heat. Openings were covered with oiled cloth or animal hide to let in minimal diffused light, secured with heavy wooden shutters at night or in bad weather, or simply left open in drafty and warmer seasons. The constant focus indoors was on retaining heat generated by the hearth, not on admitting bright sunlight or fresh air. Smoke from the central fire vented imperfectly through gaps in the thatch, cracks in the walls, or a simple hole in the roof, perpetually filling the interior with eye-watering, lung-irritating smoke, blackening the rafters and everything within. But chimneys were an unaffordable, complex luxury for peasants. Inside, walls frequently served as vertical storage. Hooks, baskets, and bundles of tools, herbs, or belongings hung from every available beam or peg. A single, shared bed of straw, rushes, and rough cloth coverings typically occupied the warmest corner nearest the hearth, where the family huddled together. In cold months, essential livestock, like chickens, or sometimes even a goat or a lamb, might share the dwelling space, their body heat contributing to the overall warmth and offering a measure of security against theft. The demarcation between human and animal living space was blurred out of necessity, but maintaining warmth was paramount for survival. These were not structures built with pride in architectural form or for permanence across centuries. They were intensely practical, constantly vulnerable to the elements, and seemed almost alive, groaning and shifting with the wind and temperature changes. They absorbed moisture from the damp earth and humid air. They adapted, albeit imperfectly, with the changing seasons. And when they deteriorated, as they inevitably did, they were patiently repaired or entirely rebuilt, using the same readily available patience, knowledge, and soil that had always been at hand. However, the dwelling itself represented only a part, albeit a crucial one, of the peasant's limited world. What truly defined and dominated a peasant's existence lay just beyond that low, rough-hewn door on the plot of land they cultivated with their sweat and toil, but which, overwhelmingly, they never owned. The patch of land outside your dwelling might provide the food that could sustain you and your family, but it did not ultimately belong to you. For the vast majority of medieval peasants across continents, from the meticulously organized agricultural fields of feudal France and England to the sprawling valleys of Anatolia under Ottoman rule, the rice paddies of China, or the communal farming plots in parts of Africa, working the soil meant answering to someone else, a lord, a sultan, a chieftain, a noble lineage you might never even encounter in person. The fruits of your relentless labor, the grain you harvested, the vegetables you pulled from the ground, became truly, securely yours only after others had claimed their significant portion, sometimes in the form of a fixed percentage of the harvest, rent in kind, sometimes as livestock, sometimes as days of your physical labor owed to cultivate the Lord's own fields, corvée labor. In Europe, the pervasive feudal system legally or semi-legally bound peasants to the land and transformed land ownership into a primary means of control and extraction. Peasants were permitted, often required, to cultivate strips of land within the manor's territory, but only upon the explicit condition of surrendering a substantial portion of everything they produce to their overlord, paying a tithe, typically 1/10 of the produce, to the church, and providing obligatory labor service owed to the Lord's manor lands, especially during crucial planting and harvesting seasons. Even access to essential communal resources like the village mill to grind grain or the communal oven for baking bread came with a mandatory fee, often paid in flour or bread itself. These obligations were rarely written down in formal contracts easily accessible to the peasant. They were customary, expected, and enforced by the Lord's authority, backed by tradition and the threat of force or eviction. And failure to meet them, whether due to poor harvest, illness, or inability to perform labor, could result in harsh penalties, including losing the only soil you had access to cultivate, a literal death sentence. In the burgeoning Ottoman Empire, the tamar system operated differently in structure. Land was granted by the Sultan to military officials, sipahis, in exchange for military service and providing soldiers for the army. But the fundamental outcome for the peasant working the land, riaya, was often the same. Peasants lived and farmed under the authority of these tamar holders, owing them taxes in cash or kind, and sometimes labor service. While there was a theoretical structure providing some stability, genuine security of tenure and the ability to accumulate wealth, or even sufficient food reserves, was limited by the demands placed upon them. You could plant, sow, and harvest with the sweat of your entire family, yet possess no guarantee that the demands would leave you with enough provisions for the following season, especially if the harvest was poor. Elsewhere in the world, this pattern of peasant dependence and obligation was echoed in various forms. In imperial China, peasant farmers paid rent to landowners, often powerful gentry or the state, primarily in the form of sacks of rice or silver currency, their fate tied to market prices and yields. In Andean societies prior to the devastating disruption of colonial conquest, land was cultivated through sophisticated systems of collective labor rotation, MTO. But individuals and communities still owed tribute to the ruling Inca state in the form of food, textiles, or labor for public works, their surplus extracted for the benefit of the empire. Everywhere across vast distances and diverse cultures, obligations were attached to the privilege of working the land, and each obligation exerted a significant, relentless demand on your time, your limited liberty, and your physical being. This constant pressure, the need to produce enough to feed your family after the Lord, the church, or the state, had taken their share, the demand for your labor when you needed it most for your own plot, shaped daily decisions from dawn until dusk. What crops to cultivate? Not necessarily what was most nutritious or best for the soil, but those that yielded enough to cover taxes and still, hopefully, leave something edible to sustain your family. When to work, as long as daylight permitted, and often into the twilight during crucial seasons. Even rest had to be earned through exhausting labor. During busy periods like planting and harvest, peasants labored through injuries despite fevers, and women returned to the fields shortly after childbirth, not out of desire or commitment to productivity in the modern sense, but because there was simply no capacity for refusal or respite. A day missed could mean a portion of the harvest lost, which could mean hunger later. Nevertheless, they adapted, subtly pushing back against the system and the environment. They mixed different crops in the same field to mitigate the risk of total failure if one crop succumbed to disease or poor weather. They allowed their few animals to graze near boundary lines, hoping to fertilize both their own land and perhaps slightly benefit the Lord's. A small act of subtle defiance. They concealed small quantities of grain or other produce from the tax collectors for emergencies. They exchanged favors and labor with neighbors when one family fell behind due to illness or misfortune. A crucial informal safety net. There was no formal social security system, no institutional support. There was only the quiet, risky trust and mutual aid shared by those bearing the same fundamental burden. And that burden did not end at the fence line of your cultivated plot. Even what you managed to cultivate, even the food you successfully grew or gathered, carried inherent daily risk. Food did not arrive conveniently packaged, washed, processed, and stamped with expiration dates tested by modern science. It came directly from the ground, pulled from damp storage pits, gathered from the wild, and handled by hands that sometimes made errors born of fatigue, ignorance, or desperation. A misidentified root dug from the forest floor, a handful of grains spoiled by damp storage or invisible mold, a mushroom gathered from a pasture too closely resembling a safe, edible variety. These were not theoretical dangers. For the medieval peasant, the simple, fundamental act of eating was more than nourishment. It was a constant calculation of risk, a gamble taken with every mouthful. In the vast cold plains of Russia and Eastern Europe, where rye bread was a cheap, filling, and reliable staple for millions, this reliability had a terrifying vulnerability. Stored in damp, poorly ventilated granaries or thatched roof cellars, rye frequently became infected with ergot, Claviceps purpurea, the parasitic fungus mentioned earlier, with its lethal hallucinogenic and gangrene-inducing consequences. Those who consumed infected bread suffered agonizing symptoms, horrifying hallucinations that drove people to madness, violent convulsions and the burning, necrotic decay of limbs. Some lacking scientific understanding attributed it to a curse laid upon the village. Others called it St. Anthony's fire, a terrifying, burning plague. It swept through villages and towns without warning, transforming the most trusted, fundamental food source into a source of literal poison and widespread death. Elsewhere, the dangers differed in origin, but were equally real and terrifying. In Andean regions, certain roots and tubers, staple crops stored underground in damp conditions, could develop potent toxins if not processed correctly through complex, multi-step methods passed down through generations. Some required days of repeated soaking in running water, then boiling, then drying in the sun. A single missed step in this intricate process could result in paralysis or death upon consumption. In the cold, damp forests of northern Europe, peasants supplemented their meager diets by foraging for wild mushrooms and berries. But generations of precise, orally transmitted knowledge were required to distinguish the edible from the deadly. One poor season, one illness that incapacitated the elder who held this knowledge could break that crucial chain of memory. One single mistake in identification could wipe out an entire family. Preservation techniques essential for storing food through the lean months added their own hazards. Insufficiently salting meat or fish led to rapid spoilage and bacterial growth. Leaving vegetables or meat in brine for too long or improperly fermenting them could encourage the growth of deadly bacteria like Clostridium botulinum, causing botulism. Even small beer, often the safer alternative to water, could turn sour, bitter, and sickening if the fermentation process failed or it became contaminated. And yet they persevered out of absolute necessity. Peasants developed sophisticated, albeit rudimentary, defensive strategies born from centuries of trial and error, observation, and bitter experience. They learned to inspect their food carefully by smell, sniffing for signs of decay or fermentation gone wrong. They tasted tiny amounts of new or questionable food first, waiting for a reaction. They fed suspect bits to chickens or pigs, if they had them, before serving them to children. In some cases, they added strong acids like vinegar or pungent, antimicrobial herbs like garlic or horseradish, not primarily for flavor, but as rudimentary attempts at disinfection or to mask the taste of spoilage. These methods were by no means foolproof, but they were often all that stood between a potentially safe meal and a quick, agonizing funeral. The concept of food safety was always conditional, precarious. A blessing one season could literally be a curse the next. That pervasive uncertainty permeated every meal, every bite. It influenced not only what people ate and how they prepared it, but also how they thought about hunger, risk, caution, and the capricious nature of fortune. Still, no one ate alone for long, and not all necessary labor was evident in the fields, marked by furrows or harvested stalks. Not every hand held a tool used for tilling or sowing, but every hand contributed in its own way to the relentless work of survival. The persistence of a medieval peasant household did not rely solely on the physical strength of the man wielding a heavy plow or scythe. It depended just as significantly sometimes even more so, on those whose crucial work left no visible marks on the cultivated land, but whose absence or failure would cause the entire fragile structure of the household to collapse. Women and children were not merely assistants or passive dependents, they were the underlying structure, the essential support system, tirelessly performing tasks that made everything else possible. Before the first sliver of dawn broke, a woman might have already been awake for hours, tending the crucial embers in the hearth, retrieving the day's meager portion of grain from storage, checking the vital fermentation jars of small beer, and boiling water or urine for washing coarse cloth that required constant cleaning despite the difficulty. She did not perform these tasks in isolation or without other burdens. She did them while simultaneously feeding a hungry infant, rocking a child sick with a persistent cough, or monitoring the warmth of stones buried near the sleeping area used to radiate heat into chilled bodies. In parts of coastal Scandinavia, women repaired intricate fishing nets and mended thatched roofs while nursing babies in rough slings or on their laps, their hands automatically performing complex tasks passed down from their mothers. In West African villages, they cultivated small, intensely practical backyard gardens filled not just with supplemental food crops, but with crucial medicinal plants. Herbs used to treat wounds, reduce fevers, ease the pain of childbirth, or address other ailments that inevitably struck, sometimes needed urgently for births occurring prematurely in the cold or dry season. In the mountainous regions of the Balkans, girls as young as 6 were responsible for guiding the essential goats or sheep through frost-covered fields, their young eyes scanning the periphery and their ears listening for the sounds of predators moving silently through the trees far more intently than they conversed with companions. In medieval China, peasant children were tasked with essential chores like feeding poultry, fetching heavy buckets of water from the well or stream, and sometimes carrying messages between neighboring households. Navigating familiar but potentially hazardous terrain. Play was a rare luxury for peasant children. Keen observation, unwavering focus, and diligent contribution to household labor were essential for their own and their family's survival. You learned quickly, developing skills and awareness from a young age, or your errors imposed a significant, potentially catastrophic cost on the entire family unit. Elderly women, often physically frail and sometimes marginalized in visible labor, possessed an invaluable store of medical knowledge passed down through generations of oral tradition and lived experience. They knew how to splint a sprained ankle using specific boiled herbs and woven fibers, how to stop severe bleeding with carefully applied cobwebs or pressure, or when to burn specific woods or herbs to repel pests or disinfect a space. These were not mere superstitions in the modern sense. They were complex, inherited systems of practical knowledge born from necessity, observation, and centuries of empirical trial and painful error. Within every dwelling, a multitude of tasks required constant, tedious attention. Lice had to be removed from clothing and hair through painstaking combing or singeing. Stored grain needed daily inspection for signs of moisture, mold, or weevil infestation. Wooden buckets, essential for carrying water, swelled and leaked without warning and needed constant care. Animals delivered offspring, often vulnerable in the cold, that required immediate warmth and care, or they would perish before dawn. These tasks did not wait for the fieldwork to conclude. They occurred simultaneously, woven into the fabric of the day, often performed in silence under continuous physical and mental pressure. And this labor, while essential, was rarely acknowledged or praised as work in the same way that fieldwork was. However, when it failed, when the fire went out, the water bucket broke, or the herbs weren't gathered, everything else quickly failed as well. Even so, when the visible and invisible work of the day was completed and the fires dimmed to embers, there was still one more layer of defense, one more system operating between the fragile order of existence and the looming threat of collapse. Injury was an almost unavoidable consequence of strenuous, dangerous labor with rudimentary tools. Sickness was seasonal, widespread, and often devastating. But for most medieval peasants, formal doctors trained in universities were inaccessible luxuries in distant towns or cities, and apothecaries selling complex medicines were utterly out of reach, requiring money they didn't possess. Healing, when it occurred, happened at home, using whatever resources were available, or not at all. And when it succeeded, it was not due to a scientific understanding of pathogens or complex physiology, but because someone remembered precisely what had worked, or seemed to work, for their grandmother or a neighbor decades ago. In the rural villages of India, neem leaves were meticulously ground into pastes and applied to wounds to prevent infection, steeped into teas to reduce fever, or chewed for dental health. Ghee, clarified butter, was applied to burns. Turmeric was considered a sacred root and a primary defense against infection and inflammation, used internally and externally. In the cold, damp forests of Scandinavia and Northern Europe, specific types of mosses, known for their absorbent and sometimes antiseptic properties, were gathered and packed into cuts to stop bleeding. Steam inhaled from boiling water infused with pine branches or specific herbs was a common remedy for chest ailments and respiratory infections. Bathing in hot water, when it was possible to heat enough and had access to a safe body of water, was considered a vital treatment not just for physical cleanliness, but also for spiritual well-being and easing aching muscles and joints. Midwives held roles far beyond simply attending births. They were often the primary healthcare providers for women and children, acting as surgeons, setting bones, lancing boils, pharmacists, preparing herbal remedies, and spiritual guides, all rolled into one essential person. They memorized the timing and nature of contractions, the color and consistency of bodily fluids that signaled illness, and the visual signs of fatal fevers. They kept small, sharp knives honed using stones and fire for cutting umbilical cords or performing small incisions. Some kept bundles of carefully dried herbs wrapped in cloth, hung from rafters, ready to be burned as incense or boiled into infusions at the first sign of swelling, fever, or pain. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, communities used honey, known for its antibacterial properties, to seal wounds. They knew which tree bark reduced inflammation and which roots or berries could dull pain, their knowledge a precious inheritance. In Europe particularly, the boundary between practical healing and religious faith became completely blurred. Blessings were murmured over poultices of herbs and mud, and charms were tied to wrists with string or sinew alongside physical treatments. Some called it magic, others called it simply hope or faith, a crucial psychological balm when faced with uncontrollable illness. Dangers existed within these remedies as well, a grim irony. Certain molds applied to open wounds could cause horrific infection. Bloodletting, a common practice across many cultures, often weakened already fragile, malnourished bodies. Misidentifying a plant or using the wrong part could kill more quickly and certainly than the illness it was intended to treat. But when the agonizing choice was between an untested, potentially dangerous cure based on tradition and doing absolutely nothing while a loved one suffered, the decision was rarely difficult. Knowledge was transmitted from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, not through written texts or formal schooling which were inaccessible, but through oral tradition, practical application, endless observation, and the sharp, enduring lessons of memory etched by success and failure. Each household, regardless of its poverty, possessed its own fundamental set of tools for survival and healing. A basic knife, a large needle for stitching wounds or cloth, a clean piece of cloth, and a handful of specific leaves, barks and roots whose names and uses were never recorded in books, but were as vital as grain. And yet, even with all this accumulated knowledge, even after every traditional treatment was attempted, some ailments remained beyond the reach of herbal remedies, clean water, or fervent prayer. Things that seemed to exist in the deep darkness of night, carried on the wind, or present in the unsettling silence after the last flickering candle was extinguished. When the chores were done, the few animals fed and settled, the fires banked down to dying embers, and the last remnants of food scraped meticulously from the pot, a heavy silence settled in. Not just a physical silence in the room as bodies lay still, but a quietness of the mind, a transition from the external demands of labor to the internal landscape of thought and feeling. Night was not solely a time for physical rest. It was a time of heightened vulnerability to the biting cold, yes, but also to thoughts and fears that had no space or time to surface during the relentless demands of daylight hours. Fear, both rational and irrational, took on its own form and weight after dark. In many parts of Europe, iron objects, a horseshoe, a knife, a piece of metal, were placed near doorways or buried beneath thresholds, not to physically impede people, but to repel perceived malevolent spirits or evil influences that were believed to wander after dark. A horseshoe nailed above the doorframe for luck and protection, a knife tucked beneath the straw sleeping area. In West Africa, expert storytellers recounted tales of ancestors, nature spirits, and cunning trickster gods after sunset, not just for entertainment, but explicitly to instruct children and adults on what to fear, what to respect, and what names or topics should never be spoken aloud after dark, for fear of attracting unwanted attention. In the Andean highlands, cocoa leaves were burned in small offerings for protection against misfortune or spiritual threats. In Japan, ofuda charms, paper talismans inscribed with sacred names, were pasted near sleeping areas or doorways to ward off illness, misfortune, or something more ominous and undefined that lurked in the darkness. These were not theatrical gestures or quaint folklore to the peasant. They were vital systems of psychological survival, frameworks for understanding and navigating a world filled with unseen dangers that science couldn't explain. Children clung to stories about clever animals outwitting danger and protective spirits guarding the home. Elders whispered warnings about specific fields or woods that were rumored to swallow people whole, or places where malevolent forces gathered. Some believed that uttering a specific prayer at planting time could enhance crop growth and protect against blight. Others believed failure to perform a ritual or utter the correct words could invite ruin upon the entire harvest. The world to them seemed dense with invisible rules and forces, both benevolent and malevolent, and adhering to these unwritten rules, these customs and superstitions, provided a crucial structure against the overwhelming chaos and unpredictability of their lives. Superstition, to an outside observer with a modern scientific worldview, often appears as a sign of ignorance or weakness. But for the medieval peasant, it provided a functional framework for understanding, a means of interpreting random misfortune, and a way to feel they had some small measure of agency or influence in a world where they had very little control. If you could not control the world itself, the weather, disease, the Lord's demands, at least you could attempt to understand it through symbolic meaning, ritual, and stories. And so, before sleep finally claimed them, stories were shared, not read from printed books which were unknown and unaffordable, but recounted from a deep well of memory, passed down across firelight for generations. These stories were passed down like tools, like precious seeds saved from the harvest, like the essential technique for maintaining a fire overnight. Stories were not merely entertainment. They were a form of vital protection, warnings and lessons encoded as bedtime tales. As the fire dimmed and the small dwelling grew quiet, the family huddled together beneath the rough blankets for warmth. The dogs shifted near the hearth. Someone coughed in the darkness. The wind rattled the roof thatch. A child might ask one more question, perhaps about the old woman in the woods or the thing that lived by the river. The mother would answer in a soft whisper, her hand resting protectively on the child's small chest. The dense darkness lingered outside, but now perhaps it had a name, a shape, a story attached to it, making it slightly less terrifying in its anonymity. They lacked comfort as we understand it. They lacked certainty about the future, and they possessed almost no control over the forces that shaped their lives. But somehow they persevered, finding a way through the biting cold, the gnawing hunger, the deep silence of the night, and the crushing weight of labor. The medieval peasant's world was limited by geography, by social status, by the harsh realities of their time, but it was rich in a different way, rich with practical knowledge, with the deep cyclical rhythm of nature, with invisible systems of belief and custom transmitted faithfully from one generation to the next. Their strength was not measured in tools owned, wealth accumulated, or social standing, but in memory, in resilience, in how much physical and emotional weight they could bear without breaking, and in how consistently they rose before dawn each day when only hope and a hard crust of bread remained in the larder. They did not author books that filled libraries. They did not commission grand monuments of stone that would stand for centuries. Yet they taught volumes through consistent, arduous action, through the precise, learned method of banking a fire to preserve embers, the specific technique of boiling a bitter root to make it edible, and the quiet, essential way a story is whispered from parent to child when the darkness outside and the burden within becomes too heavy to bear in silence. We recall them today through fragmented physical evidence, the remains of mud walls, the worn soles of salvaged sandals, the gaunt, often resigned faces depicted in the few surviving paintings or manuscripts that capture their likeness, often from a distance or through an elite lens. But beneath those fragments lay something far more substantial and complex. A life lived in close, sometimes brutal, but always intimate communion with the earth. Not easy, certainly, but filled nonetheless with the profound realities of birth, death, labor, community, fear, and fleeting moments of simple grace. And perhaps if everything around us were to vanish, if the incessant noise of modern life ceased, if the electric light failed, if the systems of comfort disappeared, we might find ourselves instinctively looking back, not forward, to understand how to simply endure, not to replicate their existence, but to finally grasp on a deeper level why they navigated life the way they did and what it truly means to survive.